The first session, we are going to talk about test automation and the whole developer automation group. And we thought we would invite a group that has been very active in this. So Simon, Brad, Ashish, and Vivek. I think everybody might know people except Ashish. And Ashish is our engineering manager for the engineering tools at Google. And he runs the entire organization that builds the tools and infrastructure for all our developer productivity and the tooling aspect. So I invite them to come upstairs and get seated and comfortable. I think we have mics for you. Yeah. Mics. Great. So the rules are pretty simple. I picked up 2 topics that were placed on the lunch tables, and they are relevant and related to test automation. So the first one was best practices for front-end automation, and the second was extreme IDE features. And perhaps you can weave that into your discussion, your thoughts, and then I invite people who were at these tables or the people who actually were interested in these topics to chime in. Is that good? Good
Yeah, I'll kick it off since you didn't invite me to speak at this engagement. For those of you who caught my pre-GTAC talk, we talked about this framework we're developing called Angular. And I guess my question is, not just to sell my own software, but when we talk about testability, we talk about pushing tests further upstream into the development process, I think, whether this is for making our front ends more testable or actually making the code itself better tested at a unit level. I'd love us to think more about how can we make it easier to do the right thing. And in Angular, what we've tried to do is make the structure of the application framework itself, make it easier to build unit testable software and to kind of distill a lot of the things that Russ and Tracy talked about into best practices that just flow naturally, because it's much easier to, say, implement MVC because we provide data binding, we provide dependency injection in the software itself. I think these things could translate into your, the second topic, into the IDEs. Like, what else could we distill into the IDEs that could be my super suit for a developer that now gives me the heads-up display as I'm writing code? Like, maybe it could tell me that you've picked a design pattern that usually doesn't help you, that actually causes you to shoot yourself in the foot. Someone else?
Heavens. So I guess you missed my presentation yesterday.
He did it in a super suit.
Yeah. So, there's lots of things we can do to improve front-end testing. One of them is, like you say, not to encourage people to write front-end tests, but to push it further, deeper down into the stack and help grow trees, as James tells us that we ought to be doing. And then we ought to have testers running it. No, hang on, that's not right, is it? So I think one of the interesting things here is there needs to be more support from the IDEs and from the tooling to let people know that what they're doing is a really bad idea. Like, if someone sees at the beginning of a locator // then that's an indicator that they're about to use XPath, and they really ought to not be allowed to check in at all and forced to find a better alternative because they're about to make their tests horrifically hard to maintain and thoroughly unpleasant. Things like that. Yes, identifying patterns. One of the worries that I have, though, is that we keep on giving people good things, and they don't understand why they should be doing it, and so they try and re-implement bad habits with the new technology. Like, you give people, even with the most strong guidance, particularly in Google, where we've got incredibly smart problem solvers, they view those constraints that we put around them as problems to be solved, and they solve those problems, and then we pick up the pieces of the code base afterward. So I think, yes, like, more hints about what you're doing is a bad idea from the IDE, and flagging things up and red underlining and not allowing you to check in. But also sort of explaining and educating why that's a really bad idea. Like, exceptions, when they're being thrown, should sort of try and link to some meaningful form of documentation. So a motivated individual could sit there and go, that's why it's a bad idea. I'm not sure whether the sort of rush towards DSLs is desperately useful, though. Like, I don't know about you, but I've never seen anyone other than a developer reading developers' test cases. So sort of wrapping that up and making it look like English seems like a bit of an overkill to me. Making it readable, that's okay. But I can read code, and as long as people use camel casing or snake case appropriately, I mean, it's all good. Vivek.
Yeah, so I'm not going to respond to that. Okay. We'll talk later. Okay. I wanted to talk about something else, and that's really about balance. I think one of the things that I've seen is that there seems to be a lot of polarization. People say do a lot more unit testing and do a lot more integration testing and do a little bit less of that, or do only automation and do as little manual testing as you can, or do only manual testing and do as little automation as you can. I think one of the things that we have to be all aware of is that we need to have a sense of balance. It's not as if each one of these things is not useful. It's very important for us to look at it almost like an onion skin. So unit tests are important because they help you test your classes and help you drive out the quality of individual building blocks. Smoke tests are important because they give you a quick way of figuring out whether your overall system is fine. End-to-end tests are also useful because they help you figure out whether the final system in production works or not. I think it's very important to get a sense of all these different ways in which you can actually dissect and build in the quality of your software. I think that sense of balance is really important.
So I actually agree with what Vivek said. Some time back, somebody on my team at the last company had written a paper called Portfolio Theory of Testing, and the idea is to find the right balance of tests. I think each type of test serves a real purpose in terms of discovering a set of bugs that you would not otherwise discover, or even if you did, you would be working extremely hard with one type of test to discover all sorts of bugs. So I think finding that right balance is important. I think another part I wanted to say, I think the work that you guys described in terms of page objects, I think that's actually very critical. But I also feel we could go a bit further on the front-end testing aspects of it. The page object pieces define the functionality that a page is offering. I actually feel that each page that you're laying out, regardless of what language that you're laying it out in, should have a set of widgets or a set of components, right? That you can operate. Like, so as opposed to having an XPath, which is sort of the absolute detail of the abstraction. You go one up, and then you have, let's say, widgets that define file menu or something.
Well, this is sort of one of the reasons why we were talking about accessibility APIs. Yeah. Like, a blind user doesn't have that ability to introspect into the page, but they need to know what services it offers. Like, I think those APIs that we're developing for allowing people to do accessibility testing will also be hooked into that.
That's exactly right. So having just like, the fact that there is a menu or the fact that there's a dialogue is something that's a common sort of user interface element, and then a dialogue or a menu provides a set of services that you can then write tests against, regardless of how it gets laid out, whether it's a horizontal or vertical menu, whether it's a menu laid down as with a drop-down, and so on. And I think at that point, tests can be more resilient and more useful, more global as well.
If anyone wants to come up and rescue us.
So while we have your attention, Ashish, do you want to speak anything about the IDEs or maybe the vision of what IDEs in the cloud might look like and what we think would be the future?
Actually, I happen to be sitting at that table with Jürgen and a few others. So at least one of the things that we have been talking about at Google, at least I've been talking to the team about, is, if you look at, the primary users of IDEs are developers, right? They're writing a lot of code using those IDEs. What I'd really like to see IDEs get to is to the point where there's essentially just a plain old editor, right? You have an editor, so if you guys have done development on the Mac, let's say for, Ruby or PHP or one, like most people prefer using TextMate, and then they'll, and essentially it simply gives them a very simple file explorer interface, and that's it, right? These languages are interpreted, so you can basically just run them straight off. When you're dealing with languages like C++ and Java, where there's compile and tests and all of those steps involved, people prefer more IDEs that is in a more traditional form. I'd really like to see where we can get it to the point where there's a simple editor like a TextMate, right? That's available that you can just type in your code, and as you're doing this, you start to see signals that indicate, hey, you're about to enter, you just entered a pattern that has been known to be a bug because we've discovered it in the rest of the code base, or generally people guard for null after this call. Or here's the, you've basically added code that currently doesn't have test coverage. And you can do all of that because this editor is basically just a dumb editor. It's simply a syntax highlighter. And what it does is it connects to services that are running somewhere in the cloud with hundreds of machines operating at the same time on behalf of the developer so that they can provide these results as quick as maybe 5 seconds, right? So before you can even switch context, you've got the data in terms of what you could do different at this point. And once that dumb editor exists as a desktop application, you can take that dumb editor and put it into a web browser. Now you've got the ability to be sitting in this conference and finishing up the code that you started 2 days ago while you were at your work, and just continue on from there.
So that's interesting, because the reason why I use an IDE is, and why I really want one for Ruby or Python, is because of the ability it's got to allow me to think of the code in its logical form rather than just the plain text. I want the exact opposite of a dumb editor. I want the super smart thing that allows me to throw around the concepts and the ideas that are sitting in my head. I've got to go through this translation phase where I've got to somehow convert the objects and the views and the ideas that I've got into ASCII, or if I'm lucky, UTF-8. And that's a painful thing to do. I'd love it if, as I was typing my code, it went, by the way, you've just duplicated something, your variable names are slightly different, and your spacing's different, but your logical structure is identical to this class. Have you thought about refactoring this and extracting this and doing all that? On the other hand, having a grid of computers quietly running away in the background and doing all sorts of lovely things and compiling my code, now that sounds like fun, particularly when I do the rm-rf star. And save that as a shell script and just see what happens.
Now, so I think one of the core reasons why people moved to the IDE world, especially with languages like Java, was the refactoring support. You're absolutely right? I think there's, the refactoring capabilities on Java are actually much better defined than, let's say, a C++. And therefore, it was a lot easier, right? The functionality that you get on an IDE is right there. However, I do believe that it's time that all of these operations can actually be just services that operate over an RPC, and now a VI or an Emacs or a Eclipse or an IntelliJ or a web IDE should be able to provide those completely seamlessly.
What would happen to all the religious wars?
So I'm just going to take a quick opportunity to sit near Ashish, since he has a lot of influence in what kind of tools actually get built at Google, and say, Ashish is supporting something that sounds more like a flat editor. I really don't want to give up the extra windows and views that I have available in a tool like Eclipse. So in addition to just refactoring, we have things like excellent navigation. We can pull up a view that shows the one-off code wherever the cursor is. If we've got a cursor sitting on the literal of a method name, then we can have a view next to it that shows the actual code in the context, displaying that entire method maybe in another class. But what I do agree with is we can get the work moved out of the machine that we're working on out into the cloud, and we can provide a lot more services that way.
Yes, it's fair to say that you could expect a lot more feedback to happen based on the work that's going on in the cloud. So there could be client-based parsing that's going on and rich editing that you can get from your client perspective. But the feedback from the cloud, because multiple developers might be working on the code base at the same given point in time. And the ability to learn the cloud for the potential mistakes that you could be making as you're developing the code.
Oh, absolutely. And anyone who's used, Google has a few tools out there for collaborative editing of spreadsheets, of documents. I would love to be working in that way on code as well. Right now, we do pair programming with 2 people sitting at a screen and 2 keyboards, but that really isn't feasible in some situations. If I'm trying to work on a piece of code from Mountain View and I am working with a developer in Hyderabad, it's not as easy as it should be. So Ashish, if you can help us with that and let us edit code across the cloud as well, we're waiting for that IDE.
Great, but this is more than Google. I think the
What are you doing at this conference? Get to work.
As it turns out, we have one of those. As it turns out, we have one of those. And in fact, you can download it. It's not complete, but it's a prototype form. Okay. If you go to go/EngTools Labs, you'll be able to use it. But really, I think the work that, so at the table, it turns out that Jürgen and Robert actually suggested this same exact idea. And the goal there was to do, at least our goal originally had been, we want to get talk video integration into the IDE so that, you could very quickly say from an editor, I want to do a code review or I want to get some help. It shows you right there, hey, here's the people that edited this code most recently. Here's what, and this is the person that's available now with presence indicator, and then you can just start a session. It shows up the screen on their terminal, either on a web browser or on an IDE, and you start collaborating on it. Our early experiment, the one that I'm describing, unfortunately did not get enough usage from developers. So we actually put it on hold, waiting to complete. But I think Jürgen was extremely interested in this, so we might actually restart this.
Ashish, I agree with Ashish in most of the cases. Just one question is, how open would the developers or the companies who are owning the intellectual right be open to share the code over the cloud on a different, on totally a public platform? That is one question which I think, so that is one of the main reasons why we as a company in HCV could not move to cloud. Most of the whatever work we do is intellectual copyright of our clients. So, and the client mostly is not so happy to move everything on cloud. So,
I think that's. I think you're right. I think that will definitely be an issue, but there are many companies that could benefit from this. I think the cost of building this infrastructure, maintaining it is so high that if there was such a service available, I believe lots of people would benefit from it.
Yep. So I do believe that we'll probably see more, say, browser-based editors and all of that. But I'd like to come back to the original topic, which was really about extreme IDs and all of that. I think it's worth asking, why do we use IDs in the first place? The way I look at it is that all of us developers, it's hard for us to keep an entire code base in our heads. Yes, we'll know its contours, we'll know the basic structure of what it looks like, but it's probably humanly impossible for us to know every single line of code that exists in our code base. And I think I really view an ID as something that helps you navigate your way around a code base. Now, the way in which it could do that could be through various things. Being able to quickly find out usages of a given class so that you know what impact a change in one particular place is going to happen, will have on other places, and so on and so forth. But I think a big angle to why we use IDs in the first place is really about productivity. It's about figuring out ways of knowing what the structure of your code base is, knowing what you can change safely and what you can't, simply understanding it better. That's one thing that I feel.
One more point to add is not only the structure, but also what I want ID is a place where I get all my tools in a single place. Like, for example, we are working on plugins on IDs which automatically create the JUnit test cases, automatically the JPuff test cases, execute them in case I want it from the ID. So it's kind of a single window where I'm sitting in that window. I don't have to alt-tab or to go anywhere. I can not only open source code, but change it and also make meaningful next steps on the same. So that I feel is the more important part. So the simple folder structure, notepad, I don't think that will work.
Okay.
So
we have a question from the floor here.
Should we move to a different question? Yeah. So I have a question. Most of the talks we've seen today, we've kind of come, and yesterday as well, we've come to this sort of agreement that testability is something that has to be built into the app at a lower level. Yet if we look around the room, I would say 99%, if not more of us, are all working in test as SETs or as testers. what can we do to actually take this testability message to the people that need to hear it, which are the people that are writing the code?
Okay. We don't do it. I mean, so, and what happens is a month or a quarter goes by, things go worse. You let them go worse, still don't do it. And at some point they get horrible to a point that the product is not shippable. And then people get the point. And and the true, I think, the right model is a collaborative model. I think either extreme is bad, but I think the person writing a particular snippet of code should also be writing the unit test and the functional test for that snippet of code. Because if he or she will go ahead and update it, they will update the test. And it also helps that if it's in the same language. So, I don't know.
Yep. So one thing I wanted to say is about, say, things like JavaScript frameworks. I think I remember in the early days of Selenium, it was relatively easier to write Selenium tests. There are not that many JavaScript frameworks out there. It was fairly easy. You had almost full control over the entire application. It became a lot harder after that when there was this explosion of JavaScript frameworks that came out, each with their own widget libraries and so on and so forth. I think something that's really important to almost ask for or demand from tools, open source tools and frameworks and all of that we use is to ask for testability to be baked in. Like in the case of the Google Web Toolkit, it's something that came much later. We all knew that when we wrote applications using GWT, we wanted to test them, but it's only later that once there was more demand for it that stuff started coming in. So I think something that's really important is for testability to be baked into the foundation of some of the things that we use. Now, obviously, this is not something that's easy. It's not always a focus. It's just something that if you feel strongly about, you can always contribute to.
I might actually challenge the validity of your question. I actually think there are a lot of developers who are leading this charge in tests and testability. I mean, Russ and Tracy, we Shanghaied them into the testing org. This isn't their main thing, but like they're so good at it. How could we not get them into our org? You know, I manage developers who care really deeply about test and testability, but I think it's like Jeff said this morning, this isn't part of the culture where we teach it from the beginning. This is something that's happening slowly. If we can get it into the university programs, that would be fantastic. Jeff, I think Google would love to work with you on making that happen. But you know, this is the way social change happens. The developers may not be here because this is a test conference, and they're like, you know, test is part of my job, but it's not my whole job. So there's a couple of us here. We're kind of a self-selecting crowd.
And maybe, sorry, Brad, would you want to talk about a little bit about the Testability Explorer
Sure. So there was we had some people we've discussed. You know, is it possible to measure the testability of code? And we took this concept maybe as far as we knew how to take it at the time, where we tried to come up with a metric that would tell you how unit and module testable is your code. And what we were looking for is how much of the dependencies of my objects weren't mockable. And you know, how much work essentially would I have to do to make my code unit testable, or how small could I make my unit tests so I can make them run fast and be easy to change and all that good stuff. And there's a project you can go look up called the Testability Explorer, where you can run it over a Java code base and it'll come up with a metric and it'll show you which lines of code, which classes are less testable. And we think it's actually pretty good at pointing out problems where if you wanted to focus on refactoring and making your code base more testable, it would. We weren't very good at coming up with a metric, because assigning the cost, turns out that's the tricky bit. So, you know, we tried to put this into continuous builds and, you know, have people drive their testability cost to zero. I think part of it is, you know, what's the value in actually driving your testability cost to zero? It might be a better tool if I started from scratch. But go check it out, Testability Explorer.
One thing I would like to add is a lot of times people forget that like this whole interaction between testers and developers is actually a people problem too. A lot of times people think that like the testers, if they need IDs, then they can ask the developer and then they'll put it in. but it is not actually like always feasible, and it's actually a redundant thing. There are like tools out there which do not need these things to be added to the application itself. So one of the things that like people kind of seem to focus here is that like the testability has to be added to the application only. It can also be that the tools are not smart enough to actually adapt to the applications. See, look at it this way. If a tester has to go back to the developer to get something done, there is going to be a barrier. There is going to be a time lag between which happens between these two events. And most of the time, it is because of the limitation of the tool which is testing it that this happens. There are tools out there which do not need like these intrusive IDs, like where they are not required to be added. And using them may solve you like 80% of the problem. There may be places where you may need to, but from my experience, you don't there have been applications which the testers cannot control, and they can be absolutely tested without adding anything more to it. So the testability thing, be a little cautious about how much you are demanding out of the application. Really, maybe you are making a mistake in the choice of the tool. Really.
I wanted to pick up the topic of how to push testing and testing culture into the developers realm, and what we are doing and whether we are doing something. And I want to, give some kudos to the developers, because in my experience there are quite a few, or quite a lot of them, who are some of them even much more than I am as a SAT into testing, and to whom I go for testability or refactoring or design questions. And it's if you want to increase the culture in your team, go to those people, picking up Russ and Tracy's, pick your allies, go to those people in your team, empower them, or just ask them for help. And this is, with a little bit of luck, this is going to become viral. And at least I just have an experience where it pretty much turned around the culture of a whole team.
So I think Narayan made a very good point, but accidentally. And that is that sort of, he said, oh, well, you know, you've got to go back to the development team if you discover a problem in test. You know, what the hell? No. No. You turn to the developer next to you and you say, I'm sorry, would you mind just adding that right now? We need it. And the developer goes, of course, I'll do that right now. Like, this separation of like church and state, you know, development and test is completely bogus. And like, the sooner we break down that barrier, the easier it'll be. And you're right, like the tools can get smarter and they will get smarter, but sort of the way we write software needs to get a heck of a lot smarter first. And, you know, this sort of concept of like, oh, there are, you know, it's a mix of abilities and capabilities. Like, I wouldn't ever try and write a user interface, because I'm terrible at writing user interfaces. But if I had to wire one up, I would sit next to someone and I'd say, you know, what's that meant to do? You know, what would you expect to happen with that? And the same thing with the testability of code. Like, a person who's expert at writing and using APIs should be paired with someone who's an expert at understanding sort of where bugs and problems occur.
So this kind of like preempts that, like, in the later stages, you kind of say that, thank you. You bought it in the later stages, you mean to say that there are no bugs that would be found when there is no developer around? So do you mean that like whenever there is a bug, it will always be found when the developer is around?
No. I actually came up here to talk about something else, but Simon keeps putting interesting stuff into my way. So that separation of church and state, we should separate church and state, but we should not separate testers and developers. We should bring them...
Before this gets too political, let's continue on.
Let's bring them together. Actually, having the testers separate, we had these discussions in the corridors the past 2 days, where the existence of a QA department that lives in a bubble somewhere and just gets a bundle of binaries and says, oh, well, test this, that is a very bad idea. And actually, I think if that lightning talk, like between the DeLorean of the present and the DeLorean of the future, that's where we are at the moment, and that's where we're bringing them actually closer together, and we're actually dissolving QA departments, bringing the tester in the team. And a job like the roles of an SET in Google or in the teams I work with, you get somebody who's either a developer with testing sensitivities or a tester who actually slides into being a very good developer who functions as a bridge between the two. So bridging the two worlds. Somebody who knows what's in the black box, can do white box understanding, and can then go back and talk to somebody who's outside and actually wants to break the things. Doesn't want to know how it works, he wants to break it. These are the people that James has a problem with losing. It's like if they keep the balance, if they balance in the middle, they can do the best work for both teams. But sometimes people either slide on one side or they slide on the other side. That's the problem. Okay.
So I have a question on this subject. So I think the whole thing about separating testing and development or keeping them as separate organizations, one of the things I feel that really drives developers to not probably prioritize testing is probably the sword they have hanging on their head about releasing features and feature velocity and product velocity, and that's really a product thing. So in fact, I think one of the luxuries we have about being a separate organization is we can step back and say that forget it, like Ankit's extreme measure of let it go down till it really gets bad and then you start prioritizing it. We can afford to do it because you're a separate organization, which is completely focused and has the freedom to prioritize this. So what do you guys think about that?
Okay, I'm going to leap in here because this is one of the things that gets me hot under the collar and deeply, deeply annoyed. So there's this assumption that sort of just banging out code is fine. Like, I can write code really quickly if I don't have to prove it works. Like, you know, that's easy. Yeah, and then I end up with a code base that's complete garbage. Like, the developers do have the sort of Damocles hanging over them, saying release, 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 release. So what they need to do is make sure the stuff they write is actually solid, maintainable, and sets them up to continue delivering software. Like, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Yeah. So, you know, the developers who sort of sit there and go, I haven't got time to test, I must get this feature out, they're going to hurt themselves in the long run. Yeah, in the short run, it's going to be okay. They're going to be able to go, oh, look, the feature is there. But in 6 months' time, there's going to be regressions. There's going to be problems. They probably haven't written it. If they haven't done it using TDD, it's probably going to be harder to spanner in unit tests later on. So you end up having to, like, with more and more of the code in a sort of grotty state. And then you end up in Ankit's situation where you go, right, we're going to rewrite it. And then 6 months later, if you haven't changed the incentives, or a year later, 2 years later, then, you know, if you haven't changed the incentives again, you end up in exactly the same spot. So as release pressure gets greater, that's the point where you ought to start becoming even more disciplined about doing test-driven development and really caring about putting in that sort of the things that we do to shore up the maintainability and quality of our code.
I think it really just boils down to whether we believe into TDD or not. And I really make it a point that I'm an SAT sitting in Eng productivity. Being an SAT, driving, promoting TDD is supposed to make engineering more productive. If I believe in that, then I should in the long run. Yeah, well, maybe not even that. Maybe even in the mid. And that's the message we should transfer. And first, we should make sure that we really believe in it and that we don't believe in this contradiction of feature release versus testability, quality, ratata, etc. Because if we don't, then we're in the wrong role, in the wrong organization, and we should rather have a conference on graphics or on skydiving or sailing or something.
Sure. One more comment, because we would like to move off the topic to the next one.
There's an extra role that people in this area have. It's not just to show how you do test first, how to motivate the team to actually test. It's actually to also get the feedback of the test back to the developers as soon as possible, and building tools like information radiators and all that infrastructure that actually shortens your turnaround cycle. That is also very important, and it's probably the one area where we can do the most good, because an information radiator also serves as a very good incentive. It's like, if you have a buzzing above your head or a red flashing screen, look, you broke my bill. go on, go on, go on. Whoever does that will fix it as soon as possible. Nobody wants to see his name on a big 40-inch screen up there. It's like, he broke the bill. That doesn't go.
Yes, I agree. That is what I was coming to say here. Like, and I think the pre-GTAC talk, it had been discussed that, I think so, one of the speakers said about it, that once a build is broken, that message goes out to everybody saying that this build is broken on this date after so-and-so's check-in. It goes to everyone. Now, once that comes in any organization, the developer will be semi-conscious at all point of time, even with his sword hanging on the release date. He's going to ensure that it doesn't break because of him. Next person, fine. At least not my name highlighted all across.
Okay, I think there were some questions from the floor about the fact that there's real scenarios that we need to be testing for, or how do we build the workflow, workloads, test data for production scenarios. This is more realistic testing and simulation of real-world scenarios. So I'm not sure who wrote this, but if you want to come up and share those thoughts, or if any of you have thoughts about that, perhaps Jeff or Bob would have some insights into this. Or
first, about the user load, workload, I think the best way is to either monitor production environment for the first initial few times so that we at least get the initial load estimate. Or the second could be with the product manager discussion with the person who has conceptualized, who has gathered a business requirement. He will be able to say that when he's gathering, he's obviously keeping the base on some factual data. He has done some market research. He knows the exact points which he has added. There's certain more additional features which have got added. Those will obviously have a lower priority or a lower workload. So these are two things. One, in case of fresh product, it should be based on the product manager's input or whatever research he has done. And in case of existing product, monitoring of production should be done. I think so many tools are already available.
I would like to point out that we have a severe lack of legwork here at the moment. And if I understood Dan, the rules correctly, it is not us four who have to invest initially into legwork. This is getting pretty static and boring, and it worked.
No.
Wow.
Good.
I gotta say, these are the wrong type of chairs. Okay, we can sit here.
well, the idea is if it's getting boring, you need to change the topic yourself if nobody's out there. So you have control over what you can say and where the discussion goes. So
we got a new one.
Yeah. Good.
The challenge is towards test data, and production, looking at production is a way of looking at it. I think one of the key way you make test data is not just by the production, right? Because we all know the code structure gives a lot of errors. And probably your test data should be more closer to also find to the structure and go find out all different paths, looking at different ways of finding the problems. Because probably there could be some areas, I'm sure we have been always working with the enterprise application. We've been always seeing some of these code being very stable, working fine, and suddenly you see one new feature, someone is trying to start using it, it starts breaking. Till such time it was working fine, it started breaking. The reason being not that it was not used, so that's the reason it was not tested. So a test data should ensure all structures are covered, not just from the user perspective. If you just monitor the user perspective, you would keep testing the areas where people would use, which is very important, no doubt about it. But when you talk on a bigger picture in terms of looking at what next, or how people are going to use some of this next code, then probably you need to consider the other aspects of aligning to the structure of the code. Yeah.
Absolutely, I agree with you, because most of the mathematical statistical based model also tries to find out the code base, based on code base, what are the data to be added for covering those spaces accepted. And for the production data which I was talking about, we recently saw something on test data management from HP Quality Center, which was quite good. Like they used to take a dump from the production, which is they call golden set of data, and then keep it in till the time the next release. So that was also a very good concept.
Yeah, unfortunately, production data is not always a solution. There's all kinds of legal problems to burst your bubble in that case. The thing, this discussion is pretty user-centric, and actually with user we mean real people using the system. My experience...
Think of verbosity levels, and most of the times we stop there. My question is, shouldn't we move to contextual reporting to make it more testable to the black box tester? There's an external means, application is still a black box. He somehow controls the way what is logged, not in just terms of the length at which logging is done, but what is being logged. For example, if I want performance statistics for a certain scenario, only that gets logged. If I want that I need to know the API logging, what were the API calls made, only those should be logged. So that is one. Contextual reporting for testability, open for you. My second question is that we talked of going beyond the GUI. Now, all these discussions tend to be more focused towards web, where it's already a script, most of the times. But what about compiled languages? What about languages like Java? So can there be a discussion in this forum about providing scripted interfaces on top of such languages, which are very, very much there? I just want to understand how far they are being used, because most of the testers are conversant with scripted languages, high-level languages, rather than Java and C++. So how do we increase testability of such applications in these two things? Contextual reporting, second, scripted interfaces to Java, C++, or .NET. Thank you.
On this, I'll take first the initial point that application or a thing which is made well by developers but cannot be tested well by the tester. Now, a tester is actually just a representation of our end user. So we possibly cannot say that there's a qualification mark for my end user. He could be a novice, he could be just be a toddler as well. So I feel that tester qualification does not matter here. Contextual, yes, obviously the more contextual the reporting is being done, it helps. But again, the developer also has to ensure that there's a certain bit of a kind of modularizing or keeping the things stuff together, having a proper housekeeping activity done. Those are also required at the developer end, because without that, it's difficult, even for the tester with even the best of knowledge. In case the context, even for the context also, supposing a very, very simple example, if I put, say, the login page in a module which is supposed to be maybe taking care of finance part of it, even in that context, everything will go off the hook. I have to in turn maintain that login page stays in the login module or in the home section or in the root directory. That is my responsibility as a developer, which I should ensure, the basic housekeeping. Yes, I agree, advanced things can be pushed onto the maybe testing side, but at least the basic developer functions has to be there.
So I have one comment on the first part, which is contextual logging, right? I think in Google, I work on Gmail. I work on the same team as Ankit did. So what I wanted to mention here is like contextual logging is really useful. Like even I work on performance testing of Gmail. So when there's that debug information available, that information logged, then you can actually not only identify that which are the pieces that are getting called for a particular action, but you can also identify in case of issues that which is the piece which is actually causing the regression, which is causing the problem. And then think about when you have gathered this data over, let's say, even over a period of 4 or 5 months, you'll start understanding, which is the piece of software which is actually mostly having the problems. James, in his discussion, said that, where one bug exists, there's a tendency that there are more bugs there, right? So it's really interesting that when you start identifying those red pieces of your code, then you can actually go much deeper into it and improve the product quality to a great level, right? And I think we've been talking a lot about regression testing, etc., but it applies to pretty much all width of fields that we have in testing, whether it's performance testing, load testing, regression testing, usability testing, etc. I think second part, what was talked about is, scripting, testers having that scripting language. How do we bring it to
Java and C. And I think I was going through some of the tweets. I think first behavioral change that we need to bring is that tester is not supposed to be just a scripter. Tester is supposed to be a software engineer who can handle complex situations. Still, we are trying to solve this problem by just thinking that, oh, you know what, if somebody knows scripting, that person can do testing for me. That's not going to work out. I think we have to accept it as a complex engineering problem and then try to solve it that way, right? So we have to make sure that the skill set is there to get that going. I want to seed a thought as well, and this is in the interest of GTAC, right? I'm really curious about what's going to be the biggest problem in 2 years down the line. You know, what does this group think that maybe should be the theme of next GTAC? What's going to be interesting, the most interesting topic that we are going to have to deal with? Is it going to be testability again? Is it going to be how to make releases faster? Or is it going to be something else? So I'm really curious about what others think about it.
Okay, one additional point to most of the thought process. If you see, predominantly we are talking about roles, responsibilities, what this person is supposed to do, what he is not supposed to do. I think we need to shy away from some of these problems, right? Because one of the big challenges towards like how we measure people, I think that's one of the nice things we've been hearing also, where you say, we have already come with a preset mind that like, no, this guy is supposed to do these 4 things. You go and talk to people, what is the productivity of a person, a number of kilolines of code he can write. Then you talk about the velocity, the function points, or the time we talk more about the quality of code. Say for example, James, when you are saying they are writing a little slow, but they are doing a better quality code, right? Again, we've been talking about the speed in which someone can even write code and things like that. That has gone so much into our mind in terms of looking at our ability and the way we measure people. That has to change first in order to change the whole paradigm of improving the testability. Or another thing is towards we need to reduce that thin line between the development and testing in terms of what you are measured upon. That's very, very important, because otherwise, as in the conference also someone was rightly saying, if I'm going to be measured upon the number of defects, I would raise 1,000 defects which may not be useful to the product at all.
Yeah.
Right? That's not going to be helpful at all.
So just a time check, we're just over 6 o'clock, and I think there's enough discussion going on. Would everybody like to continue for another 10 minutes or so? That'd be okay? So let's continue for another 10 minutes if you have enough topics, yeah.
So, sorry, should I go ahead? Just a quick point based on my limited experience. So I think when I think of testability, obscurity for me is one thing that really hampers testability. It's not just scripting languages or being able to test in things in one way, being able to have a strategy for testing which depends on how the design of the system, how less obscure it is. That just gives you more options. That just helps you test at different levels and not just complicate the testing from one point. So obscurity of the design is really one issue. And I think to some extent, like what James says, right, you want to expose data out there. The data you want to expose is probably in terms of the actual information about the system or even in terms of the architecture. And to, I guess, the point that Rajat was trying to seed on what problems or what discussions we want to have going forward in this arena, I think, again, the more and more we're kind of enabling users to do stuff and empowering users to do stuff via a very platform-centric approach to things, whether it's in the consumer world or whether it's in the enterprise world. We're trying to build platforms, we're trying to build APIs. We're inviting a lot of integration points. We're inviting people to come and do things and to connect to existing stuff. So I think the whole integration testing here and not obscuring how we do things so that people can freely integrate and build on a platform, and testing in that space might be an interesting area for us to think about.
Yeah, I think I was going to say pretty much that. On the future of testability, I think that testability is sort of rising in levels. Testability used to be a problem, sort of like the sorts of testability that Russ and Tracy introduced, where they were talking about, like on a class level, TDD is starting to become a lot more widespread. For most people, we're now seeing testability at this level, at the sort of unit level. People have testability, but the problems of testability are sort of rising up to a more system level. It's amazing how many people have really testable units, and yet you have a system where you still can't replace the database with a mock. You haven't got any hooks where you can put your scripts and these sorts of things. So I think in the future, testability, we'll just be pulling it up a level, and we'll be talking about a more system design level testability rather than the low level testability, which has been talked about quite a lot in this conference.
You can actually have the other without the one. So I've seen an application which I think didn't have a single unit test, but was excellently testable on a GUI level, on a GUI system level. I have an answer for and that's a non-Google answer for the logging in context question, and the answer is log4j. Or in ported to other languages, I've actually used it in the log4Perl flavor. It allows you to, just a few technical details, allows you to structure your loggers in a hierarchical way, configured with a config file, and you can tune up and tune down very, very flexibly your logging levels in different parts of the application or in different aspects. It's a pretty old component from the Jakarta project. I'm sometimes amazed that it's not more used. I think it's one of the brightest things since sliced bread.
Yeah, so I just want to take on Harachit's thought on what's the future challenges coming up in next year, a couple of years. So I have been kind of shared this with some people across my conversation that one of the challenges which I see is we have seen Gmail is it's kind of a de facto cloud application, impacting people's life or Google.com. But what's coming up is the enterprise clouds, right? So one of the queries there was, why do I have to use an enterprise cloud if I have concerns on the security risks of pushing my code there? So I've been reading reports that Microsoft has been winning deals over companies moving their Exchange server on the clouds, and these kind of new business models will open up new risks and risks in terms of I think security. I think that's one of the major risk concerns why people or enterprises hesitate to move towards cloud is primarily based on, so if you take performance and availability aside, it's security and storage assurance. And I think a lot of new services need to be created. For example, like recoverability as a service, right? What if my Exchange server goes down? There's a lot of IP in there. So I think there's I think even the, from a development perspective itself, like the architectures are evolving there. And I think from a QE perspective, the whole, things are going to spring up in terms of assuring the risks there.
Okay, let's take a few more, one or two more thoughts, and then we
want to talk about the future.
Do you want more thoughts or questions?
I'm sorry?
Do you want questions or thoughts?
I think we have a comment, so let's
talk about the future. What we need to test in the future. Well, three things spring to mind. It's actually quite low level. We've got one big transition coming our way, IP version 6. There's going to be a whole hell breaking loose there. That's quite low. We've got parallelism on the desktop, parallelism on the cloud. We are not prepared. I mean, let's say on the developer side of the fence, they're starting to think about it. We're changing paradigms, we're changing languages, we're going functional. There's new areas there that we haven't even thought in that level for testing. There's also exciting things in the testing side of those. And then we've got devices, like Android devices. We're losing the full-blown computers as a consumer device, and we're going to end up with tabs, we're going to end up with smartphones, we're going to end up with fridges that do stuff. And that is also massive scale and quite different problems in user interface testing.
Google TV, that's going to get smarter and so on, yeah. So any other fun?
Don't play chess against your washing machine, you're going to lose. Do you want? Yep.
I have another question if you want that.
Last question, and then we'll wind down. So.
Would you agree with James Whittaker's 4-3 score, or do you have any other goals for dev?
Hi, James. So I actually sit about 20 paces from where Alberto sits in Mountain View. And so 4-3, I think it could go either way, because the place I'd like to see some more investment is on the education side for our feature developers. In test engineering, across our organization, we have a lot of expertise, and our goal should be to bring more and more of that expertise to every single one of our SWEs, our feature developers. And that might require an additional investment in additional test engineers, additional SETs, so that we can accomplish our current goals as well as the educational goals.
Okay, great. I think that we'll sum it up here. So thank you so much for participating in the last section of this interactive session. So I think we're done. I appreciate everybody who sort of chimed in, added questions, and also contributed to this interactive session. So thank you. So to wrap this up, I thought I'd leave you all with sort of a thought, and controversial or not, but I think one thing that I heard through this conference was testability is important. Everybody's thinking about what it means. It means different things to different people. It's not even clear where it sits. The hardest one that I heard was that metrics, how to measure testability, is a hard problem. And I think Esteban talked about it, says we don't quite know how to measure it yet. Brad talked about a little bit about the even Testability Explorer. It went up to a certain point. We kind of staggered there. And there are other various efforts that were started in it. So perhaps the thought to talk about is, can we understand testability by trying to measure it? And what does it mean? And how can we even think about measuring it? That's the thought that I would want to leave it with this interactive session, and also overall at the conference.